Hi friends, welcome to the NPTEL course Strategy and Technology, a Practical Primer. In this week, we have the theme of competitive strategy coming to a close. This lecture is the 20th in the series and the topic is strategy groups, another important concept in the theory of competitive strategy. What is a strategic group? Strategic group is a smaller part of the industry which will help us analyze companies which have similar strategic dimensions. It is a cohesive subunit of the industry, the study of which is essential. They also work as companies or clusters which are at the intersection of structure and strategy. Strategic group is an intermediate frame of reference between looking at the industry as a whole, in which case we may tend to get lost, and each firm separately, in which case we may try to micro-analyze a particular structure and strategy. So this is an intermediate frame of reference, which is a bridging frame of reference. It aids structural analysis in a much more focused manner. Relative dimensioning of strategic groups helps us look at firms in multiple ways. It is a very perceptive way of looking at different firms, to understand how firms can be of different strategic nature within the same industry. For example, product specialization and manufacturing integration are two of the many possible relative dimensions for understanding the strategic groups within an industry. Along with strategic groups comes the concept of mobility barriers. That is, whether a firm is able to move from one strategic group to another depends on the mobility barriers that exist between two types of strategic groups. These are the intrinsic characteristics of strategic groups. Just as an industry has entry barriers, each strategic group also will have mobility barriers. The ability of a company to move from one strategic group to other strategic group is determined by the strength of mobility barriers established by the strategic group, and these can be seen as the core competencies for such groups. A study of strategic groups provides additional intergroup insights that can be effectively used by firms to improve physical and financial performance. This lecture's focus is on structural analysis, strategic groups, and mobility barriers together. These are important qualitative concepts expounded by Porter, and as I will illustrate, some of these can be quantified as well. I have developed some of these concepts further. Let's look at structural analysis, strategic groups, and mobility barriers together. Structural analysis at industry level provides several useful insights into the 5 competitive forces. For a moment, from now onwards, let's talk about the 5 competitive forces and the broad methodologies by which individual firms can manage them. There would be some questions when we look at the whole structural analysis in an industry. Typically, some industries tend to be more profitable than others. Some strategic groups within the same industry tend to be more profitable than others, and firms can move across strategic groups based on mobility barriers. On the right side, you have several sectors of the economy, and when you look at the net profit by sector, you will find that certain sectors have high level of profit, whereas certain sectors have very low level of profit. And also the profitability varies from time to time. Metals and mining had 15.5% of total profit of all sectors, whereas that declined to minus 1.2%. Retail improved from 0.4% to 1.5%. Capital goods reduced from 5.9% to minus 2.7%. So structural analysis of an industry becomes more inclusive and comprehensive when we look at industries as overall participants of the economy. Taking this analogy further, if within each industry we identify the strategic groups and look at their profitability quotient at that point of time, as also over a cross longitudinal frame of time, we will get lots of insights as to which strategies are working well and which strategies are not working well. This structural analysis becomes more inclusive and more comprehensive because of the injection of the concept of strategic groups in structural analysis, along with the concept of mobility barriers. These are very important aspects of strategic management. There is no quantitative framework as in the 80s and 90s or even today, which has tried to convert the elegance of Porter's theory into quantitative decision ports. My research on the Indian automobile industry, a study of the four-wheeler sector, which I carried out at the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, as my doctoral work under the guidance of Dr. L.V.L. Sharma, has accomplished this objective. I would think that this was the first ever research that quantified Porter's structural analysis, strategic group analysis, and mobility barriers into a quantitative framework. The work focused on the structure and performance of the four-wheeler sector of the Indian automobile industry. It demonstrated that the theories of competitive forces and competitive strategy are not only nice English, but they have got quantitative application with practical relevance and applicability. Several hypotheses can be raised and they can be quantitatively captured and validated. This work of mine also extended Porter's utilitarian and creative theories and proposed additional observations and constructs. Structural and strategic frameworks, as discussed and developed in the research, made fundamental contributions to the theory of competitive strategy. The research work demonstrated that strategy is not just qualitative theory, but can have solid analytical foundations if structure and strategy are defined in terms of appropriate matrices or indexes. What are the strategic dimensions by which you can define a strategic group? Certain strategic dimensions as below are capable of providing companies varied strategic options to differentiate themselves within an industry. Every firm can be positioned based on these dimensions and the sub-dimensions. Let's take specialization. It can be product, process, or both. Let's take brand equity. Again, it could be at product level, company level, or both. The demand management and inventory management could be push type or pull type. Vendor partnership could be in terms of product, process, or infrastructure. Channel reach could be towards customer segments or towards geographic regions. Product quality can be expressed in terms of the features, how deep and wide the features are, how rigorous the specifications are, and the value and experience which the customer would derive from the product. Technological leadership can be defined in terms of the innovation or pioneering nature of the product and process, differentiating nature, or simply improvement nature. Vertical integration could be defined in terms of upstream, downstream, insourcing, or outsourcing. Cost position. We can have the absolute lowest cost position, relative lowest cost position, or fit for demand cost position. Service rendered by a company could be on-site, off-site, and also the warranty level could be expressive of the service. Price policy relating to products, spare parts, and service maintenance could be one dimension. Leverage, that is the debt leverage, could be another dimension. It could be in terms of vanilla bank debt, debentures, and mezzanine debt. Relationship with the parent company, wholly owned, majority owned, or minority owned. Relationship to home country, headquarters, plants, vendors, channels, stakeholders. Relationship with the host governments, regional headquarters, plants, vendors, channels, and stakeholders. You can see from this that it is possible to pinpoint each firm in terms of its strategic dimension and create a strong strategic map of the industry where different firms are positioned on different dimensions appropriately. The level to which each strategic dimension plays out is related to the nature of the industry, while in some cases the strategic dimensions are in fact related to each other too. That is, channel reach and the service position could be interrelated. Cost position and the vendor relationship could be interrelated. So we have to also see that there is no autocorrelation between the factors that are chosen. Strategic dimensions help map the industry into strategic groups. A strategic group, as a definition, is a group of firms in an industry following the same or similar strategy along strategic dimensions. If a company is highly specialized in terms of its products and highly specialized in terms of its manufacturing facilities, it is one strategic group dimension or cluster. On the other hand, if a company is less specialized or more diversified in terms of products, but more diversified in terms of facilities, it belongs to another strategic group. So the strategic group, to repeat, is a group of firms in an industry following the same or similar strategy along strategic dimensions. There can be only one strategic group in an industry if everybody follows the same strategy, but it is not feasible, not advisable, and not logical. Alternatively, each firm could constitute a strategic group if all the firms entirely have different strategies, each a unique one. So between the two polarities of the entire industry following the same strategy and each firm having a unique strategy that is different from the others, we have a huge spread of strategic dimensions and strategic grouping that would happen. Generally, strategic grouping tends to be qualitative rather than quantitative because the dimensions are so many, and trying to develop a model is not immediately feasible for a strategy analysis activity. But classifying firms into groups on absolute dimensions such as sales and profits to overcome the quantitative weakness doesn't provide as much rigor as benchmarking in terms of strategic dimensions. It doesn't matter whether the sales is high or low. If we do not understand whether that increase in sales or decrease in sales is due to the strategic dimensioning that the company is following. More importance must be laid in strategy analysis on strategic dimension. And then we have to measure the outcomes with reference to the strategic dimensions. Once you do this, as I said, strategic groups evolve as the intermediate frame of reference without looking at the firm or the industry as an either-or situation. They explain the differences much more perceptively in terms of performance and profitability. Mobility barriers are concepts analogous to entry barriers. They prevent a company from moving from one strategic group to another strategic group. That is, if a company is a mono-product, mono-facility company, if it wants to move to a multi-product, multi-facility company, it just can't move the other day. There are mobility barriers. These mobility barriers relate to the technology, relate to the financial wherewithal, and several others which we have seen in the previous slides. Therefore, the mobility barriers determine how strategic groups can be moved across by firms or how the firms can move across strategic groups. Porter holds that strategic groups and mobility barriers change over time, which is true, but this needs monitoring on a regular basis. The benefit of strategic groups is that we see the firm's profitability as a result of the interplay of common industry characteristics, strategic group characteristics, and the firm's position within the strategic group. So we reapply the concepts of structural analysis onto the strategic group. The 5 forces we talked about: bargaining power of buyers, bargaining power of suppliers, threat of substitutes, threat of entry, rivalry among firms will be reapplied with reference to the strategic group. Let us say we have a firm which has got product specialization and therefore market dominance, simple lean facility, therefore high dependence on outside vendors, in which case the firm's bargaining power over the suppliers or the collaborative relationship between the suppliers and the firm will be very good, because the suppliers and the firm are locked together in enhancing the scale without worrying too much about the scope and making the best out of the bargaining power. So this strategic group is likely to have better synergy and better profitability relative to a strategic group which has so many products, so many facilities, so high level of integration that suppliers are always on tenterhooks as to whether the sourcing economics will continue to get changed by the firm's actions. Therefore, the scale, cost positions, the technological dimensions have to be the drivers of strategic groups so that we understand the outcomes well. So when we combine strategic groups and mobility barriers in an logical manner with structural analysis, we will have a very powerful analytical tool which will explain firm profitability. So let us look at the relative dimensions. This relative dimension is that you as a firm must look at your capability with reference to the industry capability or with others' capability, or with reference to the overall mix of your outcomes. Let's look at product specialization. We can define it in terms of sales per product family. That is, if you have a sale of 1000 crores but have only 5 products which are leading to the turnover, you are relatively more specialized than a company which is deriving 1000 crores of turnover with 20 products. So your product specialization is higher. Manufacturing integration is defined in terms of value added in-house. If you outsource a lot, your value added could be only 20% of your sales. On the other hand, if you do everything within yourself, within your facilities, then you may have 80% value added within your in-house facilities. Import intensity is defined as consumption of imported materials and components as a percentage of sales. Similarly, export orientation is defined as export income of the company as a percentage of total sales of the company. R&D intensity is seen in terms of R&D expenditure, both capital and revenue, as a percentage of sales. And the financial leverage can be seen in terms of shareholder funds as a percentage of total capital employed. We can also look at leading and lagging indicators, that is, patent applications made, patents granted, patents commercialized, and new product counts as indicators of R&D intensity. So dimensions are many, and the ways in which we can quantify the dimensions are also many. That is the opportunity as well as the challenge of relative dimensioning on strategic group development. The essence of strategic grouping is to correlate the strategic dimensions of a firm to its performance and scales. That is, if you are able to compare a group of firms which are mapped on the dimensions of product specialization, manufacturing integration, to other groups at different levels in terms of their financial, physical performance, or companies which are on other dimensions, then you would be understanding how this particular strategic group would be superior, at par, or inferior to the other groups. My study of the Indian automobile industry suggests the following. For example, I'm just giving a small glimpse. Strategic groups that are high on product diversification, that is low on product specialization, and high on manufacturing integration, scored better on physical and financial performance for the period of the studies, the 1980s. Groups low on import intensity and high on export intensity performed better. Groups high on R&D intensity and low on financial leverage also scored well. Some of these things could be intuitively evident. That's why we formulate hypotheses. But the essence of research is to validate the hypothesis through actual real life data. That's what research is about. And by doing so, we add more knowledge that is backed by real-time data, and that's how the envelope of knowledge keeps on progressing. Creative relative dimensioning helps groups in the firm in terms of their strategic alignments and related performance parameters. Strategic grouping on meaningful dimensions helps strategic and structural analysis. When companies undertake this strategic group analysis, they question to themselves, if that strategic group is inferior, we should be taking care and we should not enter that strategic group. On the other hand, if it is superior, let me question myself as to why I am not in that strategic group. Am I having mobility barriers that is preventing me from moving into that strategic group? If so, how can I overcome those mobility barriers? These are the kinds of analysis and questions that arise out of strategic groups and their analysis. Since they are two-dimensional, strategic groups do have limitations in predicting the impact of multiple variables on firm performance. We try to circumvent these limitations by suggesting that strategic groups of firms mapped on any two dimensions could be further elaborated by bubbles that denote the size of the business and the addition of other parameters into the group's description. For example, we can have strategic groups that are drawn on dimensions of specialization, narrow line or full line, vertical integration, high vertical integration, or just assembly. They can be further described in terms of manufacturing cost, which is low or high, customer service low or high, quality low or high. So this description of strategic groups serves as a descriptive analytical tool rather than a quantitative one. So how do we overcome this? We can do this by overcoming the dimensioning through depth and breadth. I have defined here a strategic canvas which is comprising product specialization, contribution by percentage of one product family to total sales, and manufacturing integration, by contribution of manufacturing assets as percentage of total assets. Now, this strategic grouping can become an excellent predictor when the revenue or the profitability is reflected by bubbles in this. It will clearly depict to you that higher revenue would accrue from this strategic group, whereas higher profitability would accrue from another strategic group. So it's a very visual, impactful portraying of strategic groups and their outcomes. And these strategic dimensions and the related outcomes, when plotted together, they will work very well. Similarly, several firms in an industry could be compared one with the other and judgments made where the strategic group should be seen as better performing, and therefore where the firm should be targeting in terms of its own strategic group participation or new strategic group construction. You can be innovative also. You can look at all the strategic groups and the dimensions in the industry, and you can conclude that by constructing a new strategic group of different dimensions, you can generate greater profitability and greater viability. To be able to do this strategic grouping with quantitative rigor, we have to have perceptive strategic dimensioning and customized application to relevant industries. Mere elegance of strategic thinking cannot translate into tangible analytical support unless quantified. Therefore, we have to appreciate the two factors of strategic groups, that is, establishing mobility barriers and analyzing competitive forces to complete the structural analysis framework. The mobility of the firms across strategic groups determines physical and financial performance. Similarly, the physical and financial performance determines the mobility of firms across strategic groups. A firm in a high product specialization and low vertical integration strategic group should be having high financial capability, therefore high physical performance and high financial performance, to be able to move to a strategic group that is defined by high product diversification and high vertical integration, because that strategic group, that is the later strategic group, requires high capital intensity. So unless there is high level of financial performance and cash generation in the strategic group 1, it cannot move to the strategic group 2. If the profitability of a lean strategic group is weighed down by other factors, such as heavy dependence on high cost imports, the firm would face high mobility barriers. Not only the cash generation is not so much, but the imports are acting as an additional constraint. So mobility barriers are not to be seen as external to strategic groups, but are to be seen as intrinsic characteristics of strategic groups. Just as an industry with high entry barriers enables a monopolistic or duopolistic structure with superior profitability, a strategic group with significant entry barriers or mobility barriers would have higher potential for profitability. Let us look at the white goods sector. If it is very difficult to enter a vacuum cleaner business with a technology which is superior to bag-free technology, it is a mobility barrier. So if you plot on technological dimensions the vacuum cleaner industry or the vacuum cleaner market, you will find that there are companies of different technological dimensions and different cost structures. We can analyze which one is better and how do we move across. In white goods and FMCG industries, firms constantly seek to move across strategic groups because most firms in such industries have certain common attributes which are common across the strategic groups. For example, product development ability, manufacturing capability, easy outsourcing, brand differentiation, brand equity, investments, trade channels, etc. Therefore, the typical firm in a white goods industry or an FMCG industry is able to bridge mobility barriers pretty fast. On the other hand, if even in those industries you are able to have certain core competencies which are very high, then the mobility barriers could be erected there also. If you are able to increase the shelf life of a product significantly for a perishable food product, then you have erected through your technology a mobility barrier that will make other food product companies balk at trying to enter your strategic group. That is how it works. There is also derived power arising from strategic groups, because strategic groups gives the firms certain energy to transcend mobility barriers based on technological or business power. If you are the subsidiary of a major corporation, a part of a major conglomerate, or a corporation well respected by regulatory bodies, including governments, when you move across a strategic group, it is respected and welcomed. If a big brand enters a new industry, that brand is welcomed because they believe that this brand brings along with it certain strategic dimensions to the whole process of serving customers. Access to such external power helps firms move into different strategic groups more effortlessly relative to standalone firms. As an example, Tata Motors would be able to introduce superior quality steel for its automotive use by virtue of having Tata Steel in its conglomerate fold. As we have seen in the earlier lecture, if the strategic dimension of Reliance Group is the ability to implement mega projects to time and with high levels of technology, that is welcomed as a feature when somebody says the group will move to renewable energies. It is a welcome diversification. So strategic dimensions of the existing strategic group and existing firm have a positive effect in such kind of movements. A subsidiary of a multinational corporation would have the ability to secure better financial leverage or hop across strategic groups requiring higher capital, even if its current strategic group has little financial surplus power to offer. We have to look at strategic groups in terms of the derived power as well. If you are unable to move across strategic groups or even exit the industry, there will be industry consolidation. Equity relationships between needy firms and endowed firms through mergers and acquisitions redefine strategic groups. The shifting strategic preference of firms also leads to structural reconfiguration. Two strategic groups are having two different strategic dimensions, we said. But if firms belonging to those two strategic groups merge together, they are creating an incomparable powerhouse. When Z and Sony, with their different strategic dimensions, merge together, they make one of the largest media powerhouses globally, and in India, obviously, one of the largest media powerhouses. So the acquisitions are helpful in making strategic groups coalesce into bigger strategic groups. Henkel's detergent business, when it acquired Jyoti Laboratories, became more powerful as a strategic group. Lafarge's cement business expanded under Nirma. JP's cement business, when Ultratech acquired, became more impactful under Ultratech umbrella. Similarly, JSW Energy and JSW collaborated to have the power business expanded amongst themselves. Mobility across strategic groups, which obviously leads to structural reconfiguration and even change of the identity of the respective firms, has to be carefully thought through to avoid the risk of the acquiring or acquired company or merged entity finding itself in a strategic group inferior to the one it belonged to in the pre-consolidation phase. That is, you are already specialized. Adding one more specialization may not help. On the other hand, diversification will help. A cement company which has got north-based plants and west-based plants could collaborate and merge with a strategic group that is housing companies in the east and southern parts of the country. So we have to see synergy while trying to ensure that strategic groups merge, but merge with the outcomes that provide greater strength and synergy. Globalization and strategic groups are also interrelated. Globalization has actually added an entirely new strategic dimension to the concept of strategic groups. Strategic groups of the same industry have got a lot of variability across nations. The characteristics of a multinational firm are not automatically exhibited in the same manner in all the countries, except where there is an open and conscious effort to make it a replica. But we saw that there has to be always a balance between localization and globalization. Therefore, the one firm concept is very difficult to implement. The multinational firm could be part of one strategic group in one nation, but could be part of another strategic group in another nation. It would be high technology, high price in one country. It could be of high technology, low price, or medium technology, medium price in other countries. So a corporation that is vertically integrated in a headquarters country need not necessarily be so in another country. The understanding of the local industrial characteristics helps global corporations develop the firm's position in a strategic group in another jurisdiction. Global developments definitely affect the principal and its subsidiaries, but the impact would be different. Apart from different strategic dimensions pursued across nations, the extent to which the nations are coupled with each other or decoupled from each other with global economic developments, especially in the developed world, have a major impact on how strategic groups are formed and how they perform and how they reconfigure. So the strategic dimensions are important, but at the same time the economic coupling and decoupling between the strategic groupings and the industrial and economic factors globally has an added impact on global strategic groups. We talked about strategic groups. We also might have talked about structural groups, if you would recall. So what is the similarity and dissimilarity between structural groups and strategic groups? Groups that are formed on product and financial characteristics may be seen as structural groups, and those formed on common strategies may be called strategic groups. They are similar because product groups or facility groups may be based on similar strategic approaches. They are dissimilar because the products and facilities could be quite different. We talk about high revenue companies, we talk about high profit companies, we talk about investment companies. They are structural groups. But those structural groups have been formed because of the adoption of certain strategic approaches by those companies. It is possible that companies belonging to one structural group all could be part of one strategic group, but not necessarily so. So in terms of structural groups in a pharmaceutical industry, we can have active pharmaceutical ingredients, that is bulk drugs and dosage forms, synthetic molecules and biologic molecules, standalone facilities and networked facilities. On the other hand, these strategic groups could be specialization and diversification, integration and outsourcing, global and domestic. It may be inferred, of course, that one leads to the other, but the policies of specialization or diversification, integration or outsourcing, global or domestic, could be applied differently in respect of different structural groups. It may be easier to globalize today in respect of vaccines and biologic molecules than with APIs because the market is saturated. So strategic groups work differently in different structural groups. Viewed from a strategic perspective, a firm pursuing a strategy of specialization could be a part of an API group structurally or a dosage form group structurally. Similarly, synthetic or biologic structural group or a standalone or a network production group could be again having different strategic drivers for each of these things. So pursuit of manufacturing and marketing operations and product development operations or strategies which could lead to different strategic groups, and certain structural groups have certain intrinsic technological and business characteristics that require certain forms of strategies to be adopted. So much as we do strategic group analysis, we should also understand the structural groups that would exist and that could be interlinked. Strategic grouping is underlying structural grouping. Structural grouping is evident, visible to everybody. But what is not so evident is the strategic drivers, strategic grouping that is lying underneath that. Strategic analysis requires unveiling of both these and interlinking of both these. Let's look at the strategic grouping that is possible in the Indian pharmaceutical industry. The Indian pharmaceutical industry is a highly varied and differentiated industry, as we all know. From the viewpoints of product verticals on one hand, and from the viewpoint of patent strategy on the other, we have 25 company options to choose from. We could be in pharmaceuticals, biologics, vaccines, medical devices and personalized medicine as structural grouping. But in terms of our intellectual property strategy, we could follow generics which are completely off patent. We can follow the route of generics which are patentable because you have put in some intellectual property in that. We can have complex novel generics which are patentable, which are biosimilars and which are completely innovator products. Now we have 25 types of combinations that are available. The pharmaceutical domain, in addition, has number of formulations and mode of delivery: tablets, capsules, liquids, patches, drops, creams, injections, just to mention a few. So how do we straddle these structural groups and strategic groups? Will we be trying to do it randomly, or will we have some methodology and logic? Companies such as Dr. Reddy's, Zydus Cadila, Sun Pharma, Lupin and Cipla are leading companies which are striving to straddle as many verticals within that and as many horizontals within that as possible. On the other hand, vaccine manufacturers such as Serum or Bharat Biotech is very content and focused in terms of developing vaccines for global scale. So the strategies vary, and therefore you tend to stay in one structural group for a long time. The Indian pharmaceutical industry can also be segmented at the industry level in terms of basic product market analysis. In this, the active pharmaceutical ingredients, that is finished dosage forms, constitute one dimension, while domestic and export markets constitute the other dimensions. You can see that in 1970s, the industry was in terms of bulk drugs and domestic market. In the 1980s, it moved to domestic formulations. In the 1990s, it has moved further into formulations and export markets. And from the 2000 onwards, again, it moved back to APIs and export markets. Therefore, you can look at a kind of canvas which is moving from one segment to the other segment. Movement doesn't mean that the earlier segment has been ignored. So the four strategic groups that were there for API makers were API domestic, API exports. For formulations, formulation domestic and formulation exports. So starting in the 1960s as a large API domestic play, over the last 5 decades, individual pharmaceutical corporations have been extending their presence across the 4 strategic groups. This is one approach which I can outline based on my experience of the Indian pharmaceutical industry. But as said, there are ways and means where you can move across the groups. In the case of Dr. Reddy's, which was founded in 1984, the strategy has been one of extending across multiple strategic groups within the overall pharmaceutical industry, starting with the inception play of domestic API. So we had the start point API in domestic market. Then the company moved into formulations on one hand and less regulated markets on the other. So it was both a horizontal and vertical change into different strategic groups. Then it moved into integrated API in formulations for domestic market and moved to integrated API and formulations in the less regulated markets as well. Then came the move into regulated markets. So you can see that there is a logic of moving across strategic groups with clear strategic approaches that are laid out by companies. For pharmaceutical companies from emerging markets, exports have to be split between regulated markets which have high regulatory barriers and less regulated markets, a part of the domestic market. Therefore, this also drives the kind of technological strategy, the kind of quality strategy you need to have. So the strategic group, when you dimension Dr. Reddy's on these dimensions and the mobility across these dimensions, you will find that the company also has moved across several strategic dimensions and across several strategic groups. So the structural grouping is supported by movement across strategic groupings, which is underlying the structural grouping. So you can look at a more granulated view also. The APIs themselves you can split into small molecules and large molecules, that is chemical and biological, oral and sterile. Again large molecule, oral and sterile. Formulation again into chemistry based and biology based, oral and sterile in each case. You can also look at the therapeutic area, whether the product is anti-infective, anti-diabetic, cardiovascular, nervous system, anti-inflammatory, pain relief, oncology, anti-cancer, gastrointestinal, vitamins and others. There could be many more. Now, given the diversity of pharmaceutical products, there are many strategic groupings that are possible to lead a company into different structural grouping, and that is also possible because Indian pharmaceutical industry is characterized by low entry barriers. So the nature of the product on one hand and the therapeutic focus on the other leads to strategic grouping, which is extremely helpful in understanding where the company would be seen in terms of its overall structural impact in the industry. There is also the innovation view. Same product focus, APIs, formulations, chemistry based and biology based, oral and sterile. But you could be a generics player, you could be a differentiated player, you could be an innovation player. So innovation itself has been one dimension in this analysis. So Dr. Reddy's was seen to be a highly innovative company. Zydus Cadila, a differentiated company. Glenmark also has been an innovative company. Lupin, much less. Orchid Pharma was not seen to be much innovative until several years, and recently it has done a product which got phase 3 approvals and is a working proposition in EU markets and in China. It is probably the first innovator product that has been launched in any part of the world. So innovation may not be celebrated in public forums, but it could exist in our forms. Similarly, Zydus Cadila developed its Saraglitazar, and that has become very successful. For large pharmaceutical corporations, for example, Zydus Cadila has developed its own metabolic medicine, that is its own medicine to solve the metabolic syndrome, and that has been quite successful as a first time innovated product. For large Indian pharmaceutical corporations, moving into differentiated and innovative product groups, irrespective of the basic product, has been quite an aspiration. People wanted to shift from the cells we have seen in the previous slide to the cells which we are seeing today. But many companies did not also realize that these movements require overcoming of the mobility barriers, because each cell has mobility barriers, and mobility across the strategic groups has not been easy for many companies. That's why the desired success in innovation or differentiation has been elusive for such companies. We can also look at the pharmaceutical industry, the strategic grouping and the structural analysis from a business view. Again, the product dimension remains API formulations and integration of API and formulations. You can be in a group of firms which is growing always organically, or a group of firms which does only contract development and manufacture. Something which does in terms of strategic alliance, be it development, manufacture or marketing, a joint venture approach or a merger and acquisition approach. The growth model can be one dimension therefore, and the product can be the other. Companies such as GSK, Novartis, Pfizer in the innovation space, and Actavis, Teva and Sun in the generic space became what they are today through M&A. That has been the strategic driver leading to the structural positioning of the companies. The growth model therefore can be one dimension, while the product can be the other, as I said. Indian pharmaceutical companies fall under one or more such strategic groupings. Suven Life Sciences is, for example, a full value chain CDMO organization. It does API formulations and together they do the end-to-end manufacture. But they are not into various other aspects of merger and acquisition or in joint venture. So that is a different kind of structural grouping which is beyond Suven Life Sciences. Whereas companies I mentioned such as Sun, Zydus Cadila fall into multiple strategic groupings. The mobility barriers exist when the company wants to move from one strategic group to another strategic group in the Indian pharmaceutical industry. It is not easy to jump from one strategic group to another, even if the industry is common. The example of Indian pharmaceutical industry which I have presented here illustrates that purpose. If you want to move from the API strategic group to the dosage form strategic group, you require clinical and formulation know-how. You require high level of regulatory compliance because the products you are making go directly into the patient. There is no secondary filter before the API is converted into formulation. You own the entire value chain and you take responsibility for that. You need market access. Manufacturing formulations is one thing, but selling them is another challenge. You need to have patent capabilities not merely in the API field but also in the dosage form field. Suppose you want to consider the reverse, that is from formulations to APIs. Formulation is relatively simpler job. It is a mechanical job of filling an API into a tablet, capsule or sterile, although the quality standards and regulatory standards are very tough. But to move into APIs, you really require chemistry know-how because bulk drugs have to be synthesized on large scale. You also require zero discharge facilities, that is environmentally compliant facilities, because chemical synthesis and manufacture of bulk drugs generates lots of pollutants and you have to have high investments to be able to manufacture the APIs. So, movement reverse from formulations to API has its own challenges. Suppose you are a generic strategy group company, you want to move into innovation strategy group. You have to have the patience and capability for time and cost of innovation. You should be able to bear the risks of innovation, and you should have the know-how to conduct multi-phase clinical trials, human clinical trials, apart from the biological in vitro and in vivo trials in the laboratories. And these will take years, and products can fail at any point of time. So these are the challenges. Suppose you want to move from innovation to generics. You should know how to make hundreds of SKUs at the lowest cost possible. You should be able to handle enormous product variety, enormous customer variety with very smooth and agile supply chain. You should have market access to be able to have volumes. You should have product range and versatility. So apart from different strategic dimensions pursued across nations, the extent to which the nations are coupled or decoupled with global economic developments, especially in the developed world, also will have a major impact on how strategic groups are formed and how they perform and how they reconfigure. That's where the cage analysis, which we have studied earlier, would be of interest in terms of market access and related aspects of building a global network. Globalization and strategic groupings have got certain conglomerate implications or large company implications. In a rapidly globalizing Indian context, structural analysis, strategy grouping, and mobility barriers need to be a dynamic paradigm. The nature of these structural barriers determines the strategic context for the firms. ITC started as a subsidiary of a global tobacco giant. It was the Indian subsidiary with cigarettes as the core business. But it understood the environment, social and economic in India, and moved into multiple strategic groups including FMCG, hospitality, IT, farm support and paper. Hindustan Unilever was the Indian subsidiary of global giant Unilever, which from inception thought about adapting itself to the Indian requirements. It is not only in the full spectrum of FMCG but also in certain uniquely Indian strategic groups such as Ayurveda and water purification as well. Regional firms therefore find it expedient as well as appropriate to cross the mobility barriers that have been put by the original startup of the company or by the parents, that is parent corporations. Regional strategic groups can, in a reverse paradigm, help parent corporations with new internal adjacencies. The Ayurvedic products of Hindustan Lever find market elsewhere. The low-cost ECG done by GE has found markets elsewhere. So constructing strategic groups on relative dimensions, several of those have been discussed here, both from intrinsic as well as from external, both structurally derived and strategically driven. They provide us with additional intergroup insights that firms can use effectively, and that usage will improve the physical and financial performance of individual companies in an industry. So analysis of the industry through structural analysis at the industry level has to be complemented by analysis of strategic groups at the group level so that the firm level positioning can be improved. And while you may not be able to switch between industries easily, there is always this temptation to switch between strategic groups, but that has also to be done in a very careful, calibrated manner which reflects the structural and strategic realities of such movements. With this, we come to the end of this lecture and this week's series of lectures. Thank you very much for your kind attention.